Hello and welcome to the LexisNexis podcast, Speaking of Compliance With. I'm your host, Michael Nelson, Senior Product Specialist for LexisNexis Regulatory Compliance. Today, I'm joined by Beau Murfitt, Chief Strategy and People Officer at CAMS. Beau, I'll turn it over to you to give a quick intro.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Great to be here, and thanks for the opportunity to have a conversation with you today. For background, I'm the Chief Strategy and People Officer at CAMS. I've been a member of CAMS for more than 20 years, and really excited to talk to you today about some of the conversation around ESG.
Thank you very much indeed. Look, as Beau mentioned, today we're going to be addressing some of the issues around what the rush towards the adoption of ESG reporting looks like for organizations in the Asia-Pacific region and beyond. The reason that we're doing this is that over the course of the past 18 months, 2 years, we've seen a steady groundswell in organizations and their regulators taking the view that there's an increasing need to understand where an organization is at, not purely in terms of their financial reporting, but in other aspects of the way that their operations and their business affect different sorts of areas, including the environment, broader society, and the obligations they have in terms of governance reporting. APRA, in their latest climate risk self-assessment survey, found that 4 out of 5 boards look at climate risk on a regular basis, while about 2/3 of those have begun to incorporate climate risk into their strategic planning process. Nearly 3/4 of institutions said they had one or more climate-related targets in place. However, around 23% of those institutions don't have any metrics at all to measure and monitor climate risks. Now, obviously in Australia, as we've learnt very recently, there are moves afoot to begin to institute frameworks in relation to that. But first, I think it's important that we bring the whole notion of ESG into context. So, Beau, maybe you can explain, when we say ESG, what do we mean by that?
Well, Michael, it's obviously a fairly broad area, but the acronym itself is focused on the term environmental, social, and governance. But I think you alluded to it quite well in your introduction there, just around the concept of ESG being broader than just financial reporting. It's about what is the impact that corporates have on items bigger than themselves. So the impacts on the environment, the impacts on society, and I guess the governance piece does tend to focus on corporate ethics in particular. And I guess this whole space has evolved from a number of different areas, but when you think about it from a reporting point of view, the term triple bottom line was coined by John Elkington sort of more than 25 years ago to really focus organizations away from just the profit and loss statement in terms of what is the broader impact that these organizations are having on the world around us. And we've also seen, over time as well, from an investment lens, this terminology and the growth of this sort of space evolving from the 1960s, but even more recently in terms of who cares wins. There was a paper coming out from the UN that talked very much about organizations and the need for them to focus on areas outside of the pure profit and loss statement. And I think we've seen those sort of areas converge over time. We've seen various different terminologies and frameworks evolve, but very much the focus at the moment is on that acronym of environmental, social, and governance, and ESG. And I guess fundamentally what that means is, how do we work together, not just to drive corporate profits, but to have a bigger impact and operate in a way that that benefits the broader society and the environment within which we operate. So that's sort of how I look at it, and I think fundamentally where we are at the moment in that sort of regime is there is a really strong focus on ESG at the moment, which is, I think, driven by and large by that collective societal pressure that we're putting on organisations to demonstrate that they're acting in the interests of the broader society and the environment, and I think that's come to the fore more and more urgently with the shift and the appreciation for climate change in particular being a major driver at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that we've seen evolve over the past few years are aspects of what could possibly fall into that broader topic of ESG. So, for example, the more and more regulatory focus in areas around sort of anti-bribery and corruption pushes towards identifying where modern slavery might be employed in the production of goods and the provision of services. Looking at more broadly focused on particular elements of corporate governance and making sure that the boards are alive to their particular duties, which I think in isolation have grown into a fairly formidable set of rules and regulations. But it seems to me, and I'd be interested to see whether you agree, that what ESG does is begin to bind those kind of disparate threads into something more of a coherent tapestry. Would you agree?
Yeah, certainly would agree with that, Michael. I think that this whole area of ESG does bring together those varying different sort of threads, I suppose, or themes perhaps, where we've seen really positive regulatory progress and legal progress in areas that are really important to the broader society. And I think you've touched on a few there with anti-bribery and corruption and modern slavery. And I think in an Australian context, we've seen an increase around anti-money laundering, for example, as well. Those sorts of tightening of regulatory or legal accountability, and then we're seeing, and I think in concert with that, we have seen a really strong consumer-driven and business-driven push around things like the social contract with varying societies, and also I think from an environmental perspective, we've seen that shift in terms of climate reporting and climate disclosures, and really what I think that's bringing to the fore is a new way of looking at that contract between organisations and society. And I think ESG has really come to the fore as the umbrella or the coherent sort of framework within which people can refer to and operate within. And I guess that's what we're seeing at the moment is ESG is that umbrella for all of those sort of governance, ethics, social elements and environmental elements.
Yeah, and I think the point that you made about what's driving this adoption is a really important point. I think there was a report that PwC released in 2021 in their Global Investor ESG survey that found around half of the investors they surveyed were willing to divest from companies that weren't taking sufficient action on ESG issues. And when you think about, for example, in Asia Pac, when you're talking about ESG-related funds under management, that's anticipated to reach something north of $3.3 trillion in 2026. So there's a lot of money in play here. So obviously that's one factor that's driving organizations to begin to adopt frameworks like this. And I think one of the other things we've seen is that while investors have a role to play, obviously, shareholders, individual shareholders are beginning to take the view that there are potentially actions that they can take to drive change, even at an activist chair level, to try and force companies to begin to disclose where where they're at. But I wonder who else do you see driving this change beyond simply the institutional investors and maybe the minority shareholders? Where else is this push coming from?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Michael. I think that, clearly we've seen that shift that you're talking about in terms of investor, where investors are putting their money, and I think that's a really significant global trend that we're seeing. And I think there are a range of other stakeholders that have a really strong influence around this as well. And I think consumers are very much at the forefront of driving some of this corporate change. I think there is a recognition that consumers are willing to shift their buying preferences from companies that can demonstrate their commitment to the environment and operate in a socially responsible way. And I think that is a major stakeholder group clearly that has a direct impact on bottom line. And I think that's partly driving where investors are seeing the need to shift towards those ESG type organisations. And I think apart from that, we're also seeing that within organisations themselves as well. So I know from an employer branding perspective, I guess and having the people remit under my role at the moment is we are seeing that millennial and the younger generation sort of coming through, who want to work for organisations that at a minimum would not be having a negative impact on society and a negative impact on the environment. And I think even more so seeking actively to be involved with organisations that are proactively doing well or having a positive impact in that space. And I think in a talent in a marketplace that's sort of looking extensively for talented people and energy, that's making a big difference to the thinking within organisations about how they actually position to attract people to their organisation. So I think it's consumer. I think there's a really strong employee component that's linked to this, and then clearly shareholders and investors at the end of the day as well. And I think that's really what we're seeing. And I think even from an organisational point of view, we do a lot of work in the public sector, and we're seeing increasingly as well that the public sector we're seeing a shift in that space as well, that they are proactively putting restraints or expectations within contracts around triple bottom line or ESG type related conditions to drive certain behaviours from vendors to government as well. And so I think they're another major stakeholder, and obviously that's driven from the public policy and the broader societal impacts there as well. So yeah, there are a couple of other audiences I think care quite a lot about this ESG space at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. That particularly that last point. Obviously, there are external drivers and there are internal drivers, but as we've seen when RFPs come out, for example, obviously you need to demonstrate, for example, that you're compliant with modern slavery legislation, and it'll be interesting to see when those RFPs now take a turn to require organisations to demonstrate what they're doing in terms of ESG as well. I think that might also play another role in nudging organisations in the right direction, so to speak. So look, if we've covered off sort of the what of ESG and we've covered off the why of ESG, let's move on to the how of ESG. So one of the issues that we've seen is that there are a plethora of frameworks that different jurisdictions and different sectors have begun to introduce in order to begin to plot the metrics that they're gathering within the organization, the different sort of data sets, into something that makes a coherent picture of the organization's position when it comes to, what they're reporting on. Where do you see that at the moment at a global level?
Look, I think Michael, where we're seeing the reporting frameworks or the disclosure frameworks come into play, the fundamental reporting frameworks, or the most common reporting frameworks we run into, would be the Global Reporting Initiative, which has been around for some time now, and the framework for reporting around that, by and large, is probably the most commonly used one that we would see and that we would come across. I think we're seeing now with the International Financial Reporting Standards Organisation have really brought together a working party that incorporates the GRI, that incorporates the UN and so forth. And I think that looks like becoming probably the international standard for the reporting framework anyway, in terms of how we disclose that information in a way that can be compared from organisation to organisation. We have seen a lot of organisations use the UN Sustainability Development Goals as a framework as well for reporting back what they're doing in the ESG space, and that's been quite commonly used as well. But I think what we're seeing is that GRI, working with the International Sustainability Standards Board and that broader working group is really what will drive the international standards for ESG reporting. And I think anyone that's sort of had an opportunity to look at that will see that it's still it provides a good framework for that reporting regime, but obviously there's still quite a lot of scope for individual companies to develop and evolve what it is specifically that they want to report on up to the varying authorities.
Yeah, because that's a really interesting point, because I think that certainly if you look at where New Zealand, for example, has gone with their reporting regime, and certainly the Prudential Guide and the info paper that ASIC released, they seem to be indicating that certainly within the narrow confines of the sectors that they look after, certainly in New Zealand's case, I think it's sort of the top 200 largest organisations there, they're looking at the TCFD framework. So how do you see that particular framework, given it's financial sector specific, incorporated into some of the other standards that you might see flow from what happens out of the ISSB, for example? Do you think it'll complement and be part of a broader reporting framework, or do you think they'll sit alongside each other?
Look, I think ultimately one would think that they'll come together in a consolidated way, but clearly, as you've outlined, like particularly in the financial services sector, the TCFD guidelines play a key role. And I think the point there is it's around climate related disclosure, and I think that in and of itself is one of the major aspects that we're seeing at the moment, is that a lot of the mandatory disclosure frameworks that have been released, and you mentioned the New Zealand one, and then there's obviously we've seen that in the UK as well, some of the specifics around mandatory disclosures on climate related risks and climate related information. And I think that is a really big area, but it does fit, certainly in our view, it does fit within that broader GRI and ISSB framework, is almost, in many ways, as a part of that broader ESG framework for reporting, but clearly when it comes to the legislation specifically around mandatory disclosures, that TCFD framework at the moment is or climate-related disclosures is the key reference that most organisations would be using at this point in time. But ultimately, certainly, I think it forms the basis for, if we're thinking about our, I guess, broader credentials as an organisation under that ESG banner. It's the climate or the environmental side is one part of it, and there are other broader environmental challenges than just certainly carbon and the reporting back on climate change related information, albeit that's a huge focus at the moment, whether it's net zero plans that are afoot in most of the developing world at the moment.
Yeah, and I think I think you're right. I think that will play out in time, because obviously at the moment we've got different jurisdictions looking, obviously weighted to their own particular needs and their own particular, styles of law. Ultimately, I think you're right. We're going to need something that takes a holistic approach to mapping and measuring, because of course in Europe you've got the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that looks at kind of what activities are sort of considered sustainable and report against that. In the UK, it's more disclosures along the line of what's called in TCFD. But what else are you seeing around the world? For example, sort of in Asia, for example, are you seeing much movement in that regard?
I think climate-related disclosures is really the major focus in Asia. Mm-hmm. And I think we'll see a bit more of that. I think you mentioned a really important point there around the European financial reporting standards and the adoption recently by the EU of those sustainability disclosures, which are broader. And I think that's probably a really exciting thing that we're seeing. Certainly our UK office is probably experiencing that at, being in that region and really seeing the impetus around that broader ESG reporting. That's where most of what we're looking at is. And then I suppose Asia, we are seeing a shift towards some of that climate-related disclosures. Singapore, Thailand, those sort of countries, and then in the US, I think the Security Exchange Commission is very much sort of focusing in on the requirements for mandatory disclosure around climate-related information at the moment as well. So that's sort of the trend that we're seeing. I think if you look at it, I guess holistically, it seems that the Europeans are probably leading the legislative standards there, and then many of the other countries internationally are slowly stepping up to formalise that legislation particularly around climate disclosures.
Yeah, and then I guess that feeds into the next point about once you've worked out what framework you're going to begin to adopt in a way that makes good sense to the kind of organisation you are and the kind of jurisdiction in which you operate in. And I think ultimately, you're right, earlier point about having a consistent framework globally, because the last thing I imagine organisations would want to do is report different data using different metrics to different regulators if they operate in different jurisdictions. But then it gets back to that fundamental point about how do organisations begin this process? Where do they start when it comes to looking at which areas of their business might have an impact either on the environment or society or governance? How do they measure the extent of that impact, and what strategies do they begin to adopt once they've worked out what those areas are? What strategies do they begin to adopt to try and mitigate the risks associated with that, or potentially take advantage of the opportunities that flow? So when you're working with organizations, how do you help them begin to map that initial phase out?
Yeah, it's a really interesting area. And I think, Michael, what we are seeing is different organisations clearly are at different levels of maturity along this process. Some organisations have been working, in reporting around corporate sustainability and so forth for a long period of time and in different ways and different shapes and forms. Others are sort of have reached the phase where they've been by and large reporting back in an obligatory sense, but haven't necessarily matured to the point where they've actually got a meaningful management plan or strategy built around this. And I think where we're seeing organisations getting the most value at the moment is through, first and foremost, agreeing a framework for managing ESG, very much in the same way that they would, we're seeing organisations at the moment try to identify, well, how do we manage cyber risk, or how do we manage other areas of our business? And it's through the development, first and foremost, of a framework, and then I think from there, what we're seeing is those frameworks need to encompass, and I think it's spelt out in some of the papers that have been put out around ESG is, what's the strategy, what are the risks, and how are we going to measure it? That sort of a overarching management and governance strategy is really important. And I think what we're seeing is that people agreeing on that framework and broader policy, and then developing up what I would call a sustainability plan. You might call it an ESG plan or an ESG strategy that encompasses, your net zero or your climate obligations, that encompasses ideally some of those governance obligations and social elements of what you're doing. So I think having some clear goals or outcomes that you're hoping to achieve, and then, like any good strategic management sort of practice, develop up some of the strategies that will help you execute and achieve those goals or outcomes, identify the risks that are associated with that, and then also put in place the right measurement framework. So, and then I think importantly, when you're developing that and developing the plan, the risks, identifying the risks and identifying sort of how you're going to measure success, then being clear about, well, that's what we want to do as an organisation, and that should really drive, some of the compliance piece and some of the reporting pieces. Then map that back to your compliance obligations and your reporting requirements to meet those reporting obligations that we're seeing. So I think if you try to do it perhaps purely in response to the regulation, it can be quite challenging. But I think if you're clear about, genuinely clear about where you want to go and what you want to achieve and how you're going to measure it, I think that is a proven way of really driving that, and also demonstrating to all your stakeholders that you're serious about what you're doing. And probably fitting into that mix, the other piece that we've seen as part of that broader ESG framework is making sure that you link in the strategic or the strategy and the initiatives into your capital allocation and budgeting type processes. So how do you make sure that you're actually impacting the environmental, social and governance objectives with some of the projects that you're implementing, and capturing it through that planning process, planning and budgeting process as well. So, I think that's where organisations need to start moving to. We're seeing that already, that people are moving from purely just a reporting type mentality to how do we actually set this up in a way that we can manage it effectively, and the reporting becomes more of a byproduct of an effective management process.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, because reporting, although it does seem to be the priority at the moment, and people trying to work out, what and how, ultimately what this is designed to do isn't simply to demonstrate where you're at, but allow you to demonstrate that you are actually making changes within the organization and across the kind of the broader ecology of the organization, looking at sort of third parties and so on, that are creating a positive outcome in relation to each of the areas that the business currently impacts. And I think to that point you made before about a sort of mature environment, I mean, clearly there are organizations that have been working towards areas in this for some time now. So potentially there are already some models that people could look to, not simply sort of at the theoretical level, but also the practical application of that theory within given environments and in given jurisdictions. I guess that the final piece in the puzzle is going to be how you can demonstrate this when you introduce auditors who are coming in and considering the data and verifying the data that you're basing your opinions on. Do you see a role for a new sort of auditor?
Yeah, very much so. I think the audit and assurance piece will be a really significant part of this, in both in terms of internal audit and external audit, and clearly the frameworks and the reporting standards and so forth will provide that guidance and will provide that broader guidance for auditors and for audit and assurance moving forward. I think clearly what organisations are doing to capture, monitor, and report data is going to come under a fairly significant amount of scrutiny. But I think in many ways, it's quite clear when we have financial reporting and financial accounting systems in place that those sorts of things are highly auditable. But we have a whole range of areas within businesses that are audited in different ways, and I think the ESG part of what we're doing will continue to be audited and monitored and evolve over time, because it's certainly at that level of maturity where there's still a lot of work to be done around those management practices and what is in place, and what data we need to collect and how we measure it specifically. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done to make that whole area more robust and more appropriate, to be in a position where we can give all the necessary stakeholders the comfort that it's being done well. So I think auditors will play a key role, and that will continue to develop and evolve along with the maturity of this space moving forward.
Yeah, because I know that in New Zealand, as part of their range of 2021 reforms, at the third phase of that rollout, elements of disclosures, I think in relation to greenhouse gas emissions, will be required to have independent assurance. So it'll be interesting to see which organisations do pick up that particular baton to provide those sorts of services.
Absolutely, and I think that we talk about Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 level emissions and how they are embedded in the legislation and how they're incorporated into the various standards, and then setting up some of those, the way in which you calculate those, as an example, is obviously can be quite different depending on what approach you take and to what level of detail you go into, and then particularly, when you're getting into capturing information that's being fed to you by suppliers, clearly over time, carbon accounting and those calculation systems will become more and more sophisticated. But I think that's a journey that we still need to go on. So, but undoubtedly, I think there's an expectation that we get to the point where we can, where that level of assurance is being provided in a way that all stakeholders can be fundamentally comfortable with, and it's being done in a truly auditable fashion. So certainly there'll be a range of organisations providing that level of detailed information over time.
Yeah, and actually, I guess riffing off auditors, that leads us neatly into was announced yesterday here in Australia about a consultation paper that was released by Treasury in relation to seeking information from industry. And as I understand it, this initial suggestion is that it will cover the ASX 200 about what that framework might look like and who might be responsible for developing and maintaining those particular standards when it comes to, I guess, climate and other reporting areas. And of course, the first cab off the rank is the suggestion that the AASB might be the entity responsible for doing that.
Yeah, precisely. And, clearly, yeah, hot off the press this week that the Treasury has released that consultation paper. And yeah, the Accounting Standards Board and so forth clearly are well positioned to undertake some of that auditing and or provide the guidelines for that auditing. And it makes sense that we have that level of rigor around it, but it'll be interesting to see, what the broader consultation comes back with and where the government takes that. But certainly, I think it does highlight the level of rigor that consumers, stakeholders, investors, government are looking for, particularly around the carbon impacts and measuring carbon impacts, and which obviously supports those broader, longer-term targets for managing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and the impacts on climate change. And I think it's going to be a pretty exciting and interesting area to be around for the next few years, definitely.
Yeah, I think so too, because of course, I mean, the other two possibilities that the government is flagging, other than leaving this to the careful hands of the AASB, is to either is to create a new separate sustainability standards board that will look after this particular area in relation to sustainability and climate related risk disclosure, or potentially, and it'll be interesting to see whether this is the outlier that they're thrown in to follow the rule of three, is to actually fold the AASB, the FRC, and the AUASB into one entity that covers all of the financial reporting system, whether it's accounting and auditing, financial statements, or climate sustainability risk as well. So something akin to the New Zealand XRB. So I think, as you say, it's an exciting time to be involved in this particular process, because what we're beginning to see is those initial ideas and those initial concepts around ESG, why an organisation would need to consider it, both for the purposes of internal, external, and global, but also where it's going to go next. And I think that those the initial ideas are beginning to crystallize into something that people can begin to take some information away from or begin to adopt those processes themselves, which I guess segues neatly into, I guess, the final piece of this, is that we've obviously begun to see jurisdictions, industries take more notice of the concept of ESG and how it might apply to them. Where do you see, say, 5 years hence, where do you see the idea of the environment, social and government reporting sitting? Maybe let's sort of keep it to Australia, New Zealand, or maybe Asia Pacific.
Look, I think it's interesting, and you made those really good points about the consultation paper there, and perhaps bringing together the standards, the overarching reporting standards. And I think that if you look 3 to 5 years down the track, then I think what we'll see from an ESG reporting perspective is that there will be a far more mature sort of reporting regime that companies will be compelled to undertake, and potentially broader than the ASX 200 or something like that, potentially a far broader type group of organisations. And I think ultimately, even without that sort of formal reporting requirement and legislation being in place and refinement of the standards, that I think ultimately the investor-driven and even to some extent the consumer-driven nature of this will mean that organisations will be adopting and reporting on this information as a matter of course. And I think that, I think it is going to be essential to running a successful business in Australia. It means that you really must have that really level of rigor within your organisation, within the way you run your business, is to have that as part of your regular management reporting and board reporting. And I think external stakeholder reporting as well, is that you're going to have those non-financial metrics and non-financial information being part and parcel of what you do. And I think that'll be incorporated into whether it's separate from an annual report or quarterly report, or whether it just forms part of it moving forward. I think we'll see that increasingly, and we'll also see that the more formal regulatory and environment tighten up and be something that will, as I said, oblige companies to participate. And I think the European model, in terms of that broader disclosure, sustainability disclosures, is where I think we'll see Australia in the next sort of 3 to 5 years, would be my view. And certainly I think it makes, irrespective of that, it makes good business sense to progress down this path of making sure that you're doing, that you set out a plan, you report on it, and you engage your broader stakeholders in that plan moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think that there will be organisations that will be required to do, as we've seen foreshadowed by the Treasurer in Australia, certainly, and as we've seen in New Zealand and other jurisdictions. But I think you're right. Over time, there will be an expectation amongst consumers and investors and employees that organisations do engage actively in this space and take efforts to demonstrate what they're doing to improve their positions. So, which can only inevitably be a good thing, because I think the resources that you'd need to devote to reporting on that will pale into insignificance when you consider the benefits that will accrue to organisations that really engage in this space. Look, Beau, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate your insights and the benefits of your experience in this particular space. Is there anything else that you'd like to cover before we conclude today?
No, just look, thank you very much, Michael, for the opportunity to have a chat to you. I think it's a really exciting area here at CAMS. We are doing a lot of work in this space at the moment, and in partnership with LexisNexis, and it's a really I think purpose-driven part of what we do, and really important to the stakeholders and shareholders at our organisation. And it's been great to have a chance to discuss it with you today.
Yeah, thank you again. I hope everyone who's had the chance to listen to today's podcast has got something out of it. Really appreciate you taking the time to listen and share this with us. Of course, if you have any queries in relation to this, look forward to hearing from you. As I mentioned, I'm Michael Nelson, the Senior Product Specialist at LexisNexis, and today we were joined by Beau Murfitt, who is the Chief Strategy and People Officer at CAMS.